Okay, so welcome everyone for this PRAIRIE Colloquium. It's a pleasure to have Joan Bruna with us today. So Joan is a professor at New York University, more precisely at the Courant Institute. He is also a member of the CDS, Center for Data Science, one of the founding member. And before this, he was also professor at UC Berkeley. And I guess today is going to speak about some mathematical perspective on deep neural network. So Joan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Merci, Gabriel. Bonjour, everyone. I'm going to switch to English just for the purpose of the talk. So thank you very much, Gabriel, for this invitation. I'll try to present some of the work that I've been doing alongside some of my students and colleagues that you see here in this slide. So I'm going to cite them now. Zheng Dao Shen, my student, Jaume de Dios, student at UCLA, Carlos Domingo here at NYU, Sami Jalassi at Princeton, Arthur Mensch, who might be here in the audience, Grant, Eric, and Luke and Aaron that are also my students at NYU. So yeah, so as Gabriel said, what I'll try to do today is to try to give a bit of my perspective about where some of the mathematical mysteries and open questions surrounding this, what one could say that the deep learning revolution that, as you know, started from computer vision several years ago. As you can see now, I guess everyone agrees that there's incredible things that these methods can do with images, speech, text, but also more recently, this revolution is really starting to go beyond these traditional applications, and now we have a very big experimental successes in areas like such as computational biology, chemistry, robotics, etc. So the starting point of my talk is really this observation that many of these problems, they have something that from the mathematical point of view, it seems a little bit hard to fathom, hard to conceive, just because this method, they seem to be really extracting a lot of information from these high-dimensional observations. And the way they do it is, at the end of the day, that the algorithmic principles are quite easy to describe, quite easy to state. Of course, much harder to analyze, but you know, at the end of the day, what these methods do is that they take this high-dimensional observation X, and they, through just a simple gradient descent algorithm, manage to find a representation phi that seems to capture the essence of the problem that they need. And so they really go against this traditional pipeline of you know, the scientists trying to come up with the right features, the right sufficient statistics for the problem, and try to learn them instead. So this idea that this representation is really adapted to the data is something that one could argue that is the distincting factor of these deep learning models. So the talk today is just trying to describe mathematically these questions. So how, when, and why can deep learning systems approximate high-dimensional functions from the data? Of course, we are not going to be able to answer all of these questions today, and because I know that the audience is pretty broad, I of course would like to take more like an informal view, and any question that you have or anything that you find debatable, please stop me, and we're happy to get your opinion. So I'm going to really focus on the supervised learning setup. That's just the kind of the simplest machine, the simplest instance where we have this high-dimensional mystery. And so for this, we have some first ingredient that is a data distribution that, as I said, has this distinctive feature that is really living in a high-dimensional space. We are going to use this data, feed this data into a model. And so a model is just a space of functions that can be parameterized, for example, by a neural network. And we are going to assume that this space of functions, we can associate a certain notion of complexity, right? Our algorithm can choose between simple versus complicated functions hypothesis. In this, once we have data in the model, we can use this thing to define a loss, so like some kind of risk or some kind of risk that is going to try to select good models against bad models. And as we all know here, the challenge of machine learning is that the loss that we are allowed to use in the algorithm, to minimize in the algorithm, is not the loss that we want to use, that we want to use at the end as a measure of success, right? So the thing that we would like to do is to do well on the examples that we have not seen before. So that's this R of f, where we use this data distribution. And what the function that we're allowed to minimize is the empirical version of this loss, which is drawn here below. And so the algorithm that I'm going to mostly be focusing on today, also like not going into much detail, is what's called this framework of what's called empirical risk minimization, which tries to define a hypothesis, a function f hat that does well on the training set, so that has this empirical loss to be as close as possible from the optimum, while being careful not to blow up the complexity, right? And this is expressed by, for example, looking for hypotheses whose complexity is no more than a certain threshold. So the way one can think about start to organize the mathematical landscape of why this problem is hard and interesting is to look at what's like a classic decomposition of error, which tries to understand how bad, or like what is the penalty, or what is the quality of my estimator against the best possible function I could have picked. And this traditional decomposition of error, for example, following this modern version of Léon Boutou and Olivier Bousquet, expresses this decomposition of error, this excess risk, as three fundamental quantities. So the first one is really capturing how well does my hypothesis class, my function class, approximate the function I care about, right? So how well does my notion of complexity, or my tailoring the space of approximations, how well does it do on the function I care about? The second one is really the price that we pay for the statistical fluctuations. So this is the price we pay because we are optimizing the wrong function. And the last one, of course, captures our ability to solve this empirical risk minimization when we have these hypothesis spaces that are going to be a priori quite complicated. And so somehow the challenges here are, can we actually find a framework where all these three sources of error are captured and under control, even when we start to think about this problem in the high dimensional regime? So that's kind of the classic setup of the problem. And so why is this problem interesting in the first place from a mathematical perspective? It's really because we have these fundamental pervasive phenomena that we call this curse of dimensionality, that really says that if we try to think about this problem in the classical perspective by trying to think about function spaces that might be classic, we see that definitely there's a mismatch. There's an important mismatch in the sense that if we start from functions that are just a little bit smooth, just assuming that functions are Lipschitz, then the number of functions the number of samples that we need to identify such functions is too big, right? And I mean, I try to picture here, of course, this is a 3D plot, hard to imagine this thing being high dimensional, but like the number of fields that you can imagine in a sphere that has just a certain local smoothness is too big. The only way you can learn this function is to grid the domain, right? So you pay this exponential price. On the other hand, if we try to make the function a bit more smooth, right? Let's try to make hypothesis a bit stronger so that we can maybe hope to learn with less number of samples. If we try to make things very smooth, we see that again we end up in the wrong side of the fence, saying that the only functions that we can actually efficiently learn and probably learn need to have like too many derivatives. Like the smoothness that we need to put into these functions is just too big. And so the kind of the motto, like the real objective of this talk is basically try to say, okay, is there any hope beyond this kind of classical view of function spaces, right? So which functions maybe we can find that we can learn efficiently that somehow these problems? Which of these functions, in fact, can be parameterized and learned with gradient descent? And then can we actually make this thing a bit more precise by trying to understand what is the benefit of depth? And of course, finally, what is the benefit of depth within structure? Okay, so this, of course, is a set of questions that encompass too many works. So of course, I'm going to just just probably focus on the first three a little bit, and I tell a little bit of, if I have time, on the last one. But so the talk really is going to first focus on what we identify as an important intermediate step and an important stepping stone towards this like world of new problems that is concerned with shallow neural networks. And shallow neural networks are interesting because really they are the entry door towards understanding this question, right? So they are really the first instance of a function of a model where we can have this feature activity and at the same time think about these optimization problems. So we are going to try to describe some work that we did along in that area, that tries to understand optimization using the language of measure dynamics. And we're going to try to say something about optimization guarantees. And then the second part of the talk, we are going to describe what is the world beyond shallow learning by giving some results about the approximation separation. And also, if I have time, describing how can these ideas be adapted when we have symmetries in the input, right? So functions that have some kind of like presupposed symmetry. Okay. So now it's okay. So now let's enter into the actual details of the talk. So here's the shallow neural network. That's going to be the network that we are going to be concerned with for the next minutes. So a shallow neural network is a function f that whose input is x and has some parameters theta. And the nice thing about the shallow neural network is that one can think it just as a sum of simple functions. And these simple functions, the way you should picture them is that they look like these images that I plot here on the right. So these simple functions, the first thing that they do to the high dimensional input is to project it back to a scalar, right? So they have one direction that where you project, and then once the function is reduced to a scalar, then you can pass it through an arbitrary activation function. And so this so now this gives us this defines like the three important parameters of the problem, which are the input dimension d, the number of data points that I call L, and the number of neurons that I call n. And I sorry for if there are statisticians here that n is not the number of data points. I mean, that's just the legacy, I guess. I hope that you're going to forget me. Okay, and so once we have this architecture, now we can start asking the question, what are the functions that, so how can we think in terms of the space of functions that this architecture is able to express? And so if one takes the ensemble of all possible shallow neural networks, one ends up naturally with the functions that have sorry, that admit what we call this integral representation. And so just to bring this formula a little bit more to something that is a bit more familiar, just think about this as a generalization of the Fourier transform, right? So we have here some complicated, like some simple function phi that takes two arguments. So if this function was if this activation function here was a complex exponential, here you would be just trying to express functions that admit a kind of an inverse Fourier transform. And so this is a more general version of it, where instead of having a complex exponential, we can have a general activation function, but that's the essence. And so these representations, in fact, inherit or extend or generalize some of the nice properties we know about the Fourier representations. And in particular, this is something that was formalized by a series of nice works in the late 80s and 90s that established that, in fact, these representations are universal in the sense that they can approximate well continuous functions, as long as this activation function is not a polynomial. So the question is really, okay, now we have a representation that we can use to approximate arbitrarily any function, but then how can we construct this functional space, right? So how can we build a prior or an action of complexity in my language that is associated with this shallow model? So the first option is to try to use the functional structure that is kind of the nicest and we are more comfortable with, right? Which is just the kind of the extension of Euclidean finite dimensional spaces to the infinite dimensional case. So this is essentially corresponding to this what we call the Hilbert structure. So if you think about the functions that can be written as an infinite, infinitely wide shallow neural network, that where these weights, if you think that the weights here g, think about them as some function that is square integrable. So in fact, I mean, Francis, who is here, had this very nice paper where this space was really analyzed with a lot of details, and in particular, this space corresponds to what's called a reproducing kernel Hilbert space, right? So this is actually a space that can be really understood and analyzed through this kernel, which is basically an expectation over the features. And so there's a number of very interesting aspects about this model. In particular, that we have a very solid, well-understood theory for how can we do approximation, and also how can we efficiently find functions on that space. So how can we do learning on those spaces? And here, of course, I'm just citing these two papers, but there's many more results. I mean, there's a lot of a very beautiful theory, for example, works by Noureddin El-Karoui and company that really understand very fine properties about these kernel spaces. The downside is that these spaces are also somehow cursed by the dimensionality, in the sense that all the kind of the problems that we identified from these like Sobolev spaces, to some extent, they're also present in these models. And let me just mention, of course, that this connection between neural networks and kernels is something that had some form of a revival in the recent years, thanks to this actually beautiful work by Arthur Jacob and company on this neural tangent kernel that has actually led to very interesting connections. So the alternative to this reproducing like to this Hilbert structure is to instead use a structure that is somewhat a bit weaker. So instead of asking for these like densities to be square integrable, we're just going to assume that they basically L1 integral. And the formal way to write this is using this TV norm. And again, this is a model that was introduced in the context of neural networks by several works several years ago, but in particular, the mathematical analysis of the spaces is also due to Francis in this nice paper. So in particular, this is a space where one can still define notion of complexity, and just by basic application of the Jensen inequality, because this measure here is normalized, you can think about this as some kind of probability distribution. Then you can apply Jensen inequality and see that this space, this hypothesis that we put now on the weights is strictly weaker than the one we had before. So in particular, this space is bigger, so we can approximate more things. In particular, some like interesting sanity check is that now a single neuron, right? If a function is just a very single rich function, now this space has no trouble approximating as opposed to the previous. But of course, the downside here, well, the question is, okay, now we have this, something that looks nice from the approximation, and also, let me say, from the statistical side, right? Francis also has nice results about the generalization error that we can do in that space. Now the remaining question is, okay, we build this very nice structure. How can we optimize functions on that space? And maybe it's a good time to pause for if there are any questions about the setup so far, or notation. Okay, otherwise I'll just go on, keep going. Okay, so for this, we are going to now take a perspective. We are going to interpret this model, this shallow neural network, really as something that roughly corresponds to a system of particles that are interacting. So here again, I have the same model as before, f that is an average of simple functions, and I'm going to introduce this. There was a question. Okay. So here I'm going to introduce this f that is instead of being a sum of functions, I'm going to just write it as an average. This is a priori. This doesn't change the representation, and we'll see this why this is the case in a minute. But now we are going to identify each of the parameters. That is, so every neuron has its own set of parameters, right? That is, encapsulating both the output weight and the input weight. And we are going to think about these parameters as being kind of particles in a certain Euclidean domain. So now, if we write down the empirical risk, we have the traditional way to do empirical risk minimization in that model is to set up this empirical loss that has one term that corresponds to the data fitting, and the other term that corresponds to the regularization, right? Something that makes sure that the norm in this F1 space is not too large, right? For example, one can use what's called this a weight decay, or like Tikhonov regularization for statisticians. So if one tries to understand optimization in that framework, there's quite quickly we end up with basically worst case negative results, right? In the sense that because this unit here is nonlinear, the corresponding optimization problem is non-convex in general, and there's things that one can actually quantify in that sense. So the alternative, and so some like like a technique that has been successful in many other areas of non-convex optimization to recover something that has good theoretical properties is to lift, right? To maybe change the domain in which you are optimizing the function, try to reparameterize the problem to gain some form of convexity. And this is really what is achieved by taking what in statistical mechanics is called this Eulerian perspective, right? So instead of now trying to understand the system by parameterizing the position of the particles, now I'm going to parameterize the system through their empirical measure, right? So just like keeping a measure of where the parameters are. Now, if we write, was a little okay. Okay,
Could
so
you
if we try to
mute, just ask everyone to mute if they're not talking, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Okay, so if we parameterize the problem in terms of the empirical measure, now we have a nice linear relationship between the function and the parameters, right? So now the function is linear with respect to this object. So therefore, now if we re-express the problem in terms of the measure, now we have a formulation that is convex. But of course, now the question is, we are just retranslating the problem. So how can we, extract some juice? How can we leverage this lifting, right? So is there any benefit that is lying behind this problem? And so, and this is actually, let me say that this is a perspective that was really developed by this series of very nice papers here that I'm citing here in the top. So in particular, there was also nice work by Léanique and Francis here in France, and also work in Grant by Eric and Grant, and also the group in Stanford by Andrea Montanari and Song Mei, and also the Justin Sirignano, who is now, I think, in Oxford. So the point is that now we can go back to the algorithm, like what we actually implemented in the computer, which is the gradient of the empirical loss with respect to the parameters, right? So that's what we can compute. So if we take the appropriate scaling of this gradient, particle gradient, we can actually write it as evaluating a velocity field. And the important thing is that this velocity field is also something that you can write in terms of the measure, right? So now we can really express the evolution of the gradient, like how the gradient actually, what the algorithm is doing in terms of some dynamics in respect to the measure, right? And these dynamics, in fact, I try to illustrate them here in this little diagram. You have to think, the way I think about it is that you have this space of parameters, and now your particles are just points that you put there, and these particles, they feel a velocity, right? There's a velocity field that is defined everywhere, and once you put the particle somewhere, it's going to basically move by evaluating this velocity field. So this actually understanding, or like describing the evolution of a measure under this kind of a time evolving velocity field is something that as of course is like one of the central objects in statistical mechanics, and corresponds to what we call a continuity equation. So it's not in the details of how this thing is defined and the properties of this is really not the focus of my talk, but this is really like a partial differential equation that essentially tells us that mass is preserved, right? So it's just a kind of a continuity. It expresses the continuity of mass. And in fact, just trying back to this our problem, in fact, these dynamics really are consistent and do what we want, right? In the sense that now they're really optimizing the empirical loss. If we express it in terms of the measure, except that now that this looks like a gradient, but it's a gradient with respect to a different metric, which is called the Wasserstein metric. And this again, I'm not by no means I'm not the expert in the audience. I think that there's here many people who know much more about this than me. But the kind of the classical reference here is this work by Ambrosio. So just to make the point of where we are, what we have done so far is just to re-express the problem. So just go from this Lagrangian perspective to the Eulerian perspective, and we have basically done some trade, right? So we started from a problem that was non-convex, and where the dynamics were completely Euclidean in the space of parameters, and it was a kind of a finite dimensional optimization problem where the dimension of the problem correspond to the number of neurons that we use. Now we have mapped it into a different problem where now we have convexity, but we have to pay a price for this convexity in the sense that now the dynamics are non-Euclidean. They are associated with this Wasserstein metric, and in particular they run in this infinite dimensional space. So now the question is, okay, can we actually win through this exchange? And so this is actually one can start to take gains, like to do some mileage from this perspective by considering what's called a mean field limit. So what is a mean field limit is again something quite intuitive. So let's look at this picture and think about the network at initialization, right? So the way we typically initialize the model, this function, is to draw these parameters of these neurons, IID from some underlying distribution mu bar. And so as you know that by the law of large numbers, as n grows, as the number of particles grows, one would expect some kind of convergence, right, from the empirical measure towards the measure, right, in some sense, in the weak sense. And so in particular, if you think about this trajectory, right, so I'm going to follow these dynamics starting from the empirical measure. So as n increases, one would expect that these trajectories to converge somewhere, right? To converge, and so the only place where they can really converge is the same trajectory, the same PDE, except that when I start like the initial condition, instead of being the empirical measure, now it's the measure that is used to draw the particles, right? This is what corresponds to the mean field limit. And so establishing that in fact these trajectories do converge one to the other, that's something that was done in these works, in the previous works that I cited. And so one way to think to describe it is that you can think that when you optimize, so the dynamics and the sampling, they commute in the limit, right? So in the limit, if I first draw my particles, my finite neural network, and train it, I'm gonna, in the limit, when the time goes to infinity and the number of particles goes to infinity, I would get the same result than if first I learn the model by using instead of sampling, using the actual measure that I use to initialize, and then sample at the end. So the questions here are really okay. What can we say in terms of the convergence in time? So is there some global can we say something in terms of the global convergence of these dynamics to the minimizer of the empirical loss? And what can we say in terms of the convergence in n, right? So what is the scale of the fluctuation? So here I basically just said that the limits commute, but what is the size of the fluctuations, right? So is there some equivalent of the central limit theorem that kind of complements the law of first numbers? So these are in terms of convergence, there's one first like technical difficulty that again here the experts in optimal transport and Wasserstein might be totally familiar with, but that's something that to me it took me quite a while to really absorb, is that as opposed to doing a gradient descent or gradient flow in a Euclidean space on a convex function, when we try to optimize a convex function in the Wasserstein metric, it's not true that the stationary points of the gradient flow correspond to the minimizers of the functional, right? And the reason is that here in this plot, I just try to illustrate it, is that the stationary points, like the Euler-Lagrange equation of the continuity equation, the only thing that says that when the measure stops, right, stationary points, what we know is that this velocity field is basically piecewise constant only in the support of the measure. Whereas to get actually a global minimizer, we need something more. We need not only that this velocity field to be constant, but actually we need this derivative to be zero in the support, and outside the support we also need to have some property, right? So that's the challenge here, is to make sure that something happens outside the support of where you are, right? So that's actually what makes it quite challenging to analyze. Some interesting results on that direction. So there's different strategies that you can use to get this convergence. So the first one is really to think about dynamics that become a bit more gentle to the measure. So that's something that you can do by adding some noise that is going to introduce a diffusion that produces at the level of the measure some underlying smoothness, right? So here we have an elliptic problem that through the Laplacian basically enforces this measure to have mass everywhere, right? So this property that you need to enforce something outside the support is kind of avoided, right? It's kind of controlled thanks to this smoothness that you have. And the other existing result, again, it's a nice result by Francis and Leonic, is to leverage a little bit more structure from the problem. So in particular, if one uses homogeneity of the unit, there's a way where one can transfer this, like the fact that the gradient of the loss, the gradient of this object is zero versus the fact that this object itself is zero, right? The homogeneity allows us to actually transfer one of these solution from the other, and then the fact that if we have a nice initialization at mean field limit, we can actually make sure that the mass is not lost too soon, right? So that's actually a nice result that they have. And let me just mention here briefly that we have together with Sami, Grant, and Eric, we modified also the dynamics, mostly building on this work by Leonic and Francis, to actually somehow get rid of the homogeneity and trade it off by basically exchanging changing the dynamics to do what we call an extra stage of lifting. But this is really not the focus of my talk today. So is there any questions about what I described so far? Okay, so let me move on. Okay, so now we we know that in this mean field limit, under sufficiently gentle and nice initial conditions, it's possible to get this global convergence, right? But this is actually at the expense of having an infinite number of neurons that basically need to look at all the possible directions, right? So we need to put mass everywhere in the permitted space. So one could argue, what is the size of the fluctuation, right? So what happens at finite n? And so, and this is actually work that that was led by Zheng Dao, and also together with Francis, with Grant and Eric. So the first thing to note is that the variation over spaces, right? So if we use this, if we stick with this kind of basic regularization that just think about this regularization as some kind of L2 norm on the weights, we know that if you have a function that is in that space, then I can always sample it, right? So I can always sample it at the Monte Carlo rate. What it means is that I can, if I write my function f as an expectation of some unit, I can always have like a finite width approximation by sampling from this measure mu, right? So that's what's written here. And the error that I get is an error that has, let's say, nice, it behaves nicely with respect to dimension, right? So the error that I get, it really corresponds to like what we call this variance of the unit, like variance of the measure divided by the number of neurons. And so we know that if we are like working in this regularized empirical logarithm minimization, we can actually make sure that this numerator is not blowing up. And so we know we have a rate that is the statistical rate. So the point is that we have a good understanding of the fluctuation, like the error at the initial time, right? So we have a good understanding of, for our purposes, how far is the mu0 n to mu0 in terms of like the function loss, right? In terms of this error here. The question really is that now we are gonna sample this thing, and then these two trajectories, right? So like the mu0 n and mu0 are gonna evolve. Okay, so are gonna evolve along different paths, right? So in the light blue, I have the true evolution of the model, like the evolution of the finite width network, and in the dark blue, I have the evolution that I have in the infinite number of neurons. And so one of the natural things to ask is, okay, this error that lives at this Monte Carlo rate at time 0, the natural question is, how does this error evolve with time, right? So does this error keep growing? Does this error keep shrinking, etc., or does it stay at the same scale? Okay, so that's the question that we are set to study here. And so to do that, the natural, like one thing that we do is to introduce what we call a baseline, right? So let's say, if you had to guess, right, what would be the natural model, like the natural baseline that you would use to try to understand? So one thing that you can try to do is to basically to essentially complete this diagram, right? So here we had sampled and then evolved, and so one thing that you could do is that following the mean field training, you could pretend that you could sample from the mean field measure at any point in time, right? So that's a measure, that's an object that is not something that you can do in practice, right? Because you don't have access to this trajectory, right? But assuming that you could, what would be the error? So the error again would be given by the Monte Carlo rate, right? So by exactly what I described before, the error that you would get by this at this point would be really given by the variance of the unit divided by the number of data points, of neurons. And so what it turns out is that this baseline turns out to be the right one, right? So under appropriate assumptions, we can actually prove that basically this error, right, the error that we have here in green, is actually controlled by this fake baseline, right? So by this baseline, in the sense that now, if we now scale this error here by n, right? So we look at basically the fluctuations asymptotically. Once we put them at the Monte Carlo scale, we know that we can control them by this, basically by the variance, by the f1 norm, if you want, of the function at time infinity. And this is this is true under some assumptions at the mean field level. And so this is actually a result that contrasts a little bit with the classical ways in which we do propagation of chaos, right? That are based on these Grunwald type arguments, where the problem is that these arguments, they have very bad behavior with respect to time, right? So they have this exponential dependency on time. Here, we somehow bypass this problem because we leverage a lot the structure that we have at the final time, right? So we leverage the structure that we have at convergence. And let me also mention that Leonic has in a slightly different framework, where he does a sparse he's sort of like a sparse inference problem. He also, in our language, he would get basically fluctuations that vanish at that scale under a certain, like, a slightly different set of assumptions, right? So for certain sparse recovery problems, this result is not surprising, right? It's something that basically follows from what he has. And so, and we also are able to show that when we are in this, what we call this interpolating regime, so assume that there's no regularization and you can actually fit completely the data, then we also have the same thing, that these fluctuations, they vanish at that scale. And just for the knowledge, the way this proof works is really to introduce this baseline and to establish that this baseline actually dominates the true fluctuations through something that is called a Volterra kernel. And the bulk of the proof is showing that this Volterra kernel is positive semi-definite, which then allows us to get this control. Okay. And this is just some experiments that in a sense, they verify, as usual in these cases, that the result of the theorem is still quite pessimistic. So here what we see, like, the important thing to look is this second column, and you see that this thing in the dotted line corresponds to this, like, a Monte Carlo scale, right? So that would be what we have in the right hand side. And what we see is that of course, as we increase the number of particles, the fluctuations always, once we scale them, they are below that scale. Of course, what we see is that, in fact, for many of these problems, the fluctuations, in fact, vanish at that scale, right? And that's what we have in this interpolating regime. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay. So, and again, if I take a little bit the like like devil's advocate, right? You could say that these central limit theorem results, they are still qualitative, right? I mean, they are still qualitative because they are only holding in the limit where I have a lot of neurons, right? So I know that at the limit when I have a lot of neurons, the error is going to be at the Monte Carlo scale, but this doesn't really inform us. It doesn't inform us at all about what happens when I have a finite neural network. Let's say, 1,000 neurons or 2,000 neurons, right? There's really no information at all about what happens in the finite size. So the natural question is, how can we actually use this machinery, or is it how to actually work towards getting quantitative guarantees, right? So that are hopefully polynomial in the parameters of the problem. So there's one thing to notice, that these results, they have to be contrasted, right? So they need to coexist with negative results, right? So we know that there's a nice recent works by the group of Adam Clivens and also the group of Ilias Diakonikolas, who use a framework based on what's called a statistical query that basically tells us that this problem cannot be easy in general, right? So there exists actually a large class of target functions where I have like a small number of planted neurons, and I know that for this kind of target functions, I can basically gradient descent probably takes super polynomial in number of steps to learn, right? So there's examples where this thing cannot be true, right? So we cannot get always this kind of polynomial guarantees for any possible target function. So one of the works that we are developing together with my colleague John Niles-Witt from Courant is to introduce again this idea of lifting, but now instead of trying to lift the problem from the space, like from the Lagrangian perspective, to the infinite dimensional space of measures, let's try to do a lifting that is a bit more gentle, a kind of a poor man's lifting. So instead of we are introducing just a new coordinate, right? So we look at the original spectral parameters, and now we introduce a new variable. That is, think about this as some kind of time. Like, it's not the time of the algorithm, but it's kind of a temperature, if you want. And so think about this temperature as introducing a new direction in the landscape that is going to smooth it more and more, right? By applying, for example, a heat kernel, heat diffusion. So now what we are trying to do is to study the problem in this kind of lifted landscape, right? And try to understand for which kind of shallow neural network problems we can actually navigate this landscape in a way that is that gives us to the global minimizers. And so some of the preliminary results, and these are by no means sharp, is that for some of these planted models that I just wrote before, we can actually establish that that we can probably learn them, right, in polynomial time, as long as these neurons, like the planted structure that we have, is sufficiently incoherent, and the number of planted neurons is not too big, right? So here we can afford this number of planted neurons to grow with dimension, not too quickly. So this exponent here is right now quite ugly. And the technique that we use is actually something that was also studied by several of us here. I think that Alex Depremont and Francis have nice analysis of Frank Wolf. So here, what basically we are trying to use this lifting to actually analyze the Frank Wolf step. Okay, and if you have further questions on this, I'm really happy to talk offline. Okay, so now actually I would like to spend the last part of my talk talking about something that is not necessarily related to optimization, that really tries to answer the question, okay, what is the world, what is there beyond this framework of variation norm spaces and functions that you can express through a shallow neural net. So here we see that these functions in F1 are sum of rich functions, and we also saw that before that we can do approximation by just taking a kind of a Monte Carlo framework, a Monte Carlo perspective, right? So we can just think about the finite width approximation by sampling from the underlying measure. And we can get these rates, and these rates are not optimal in general. So there's some certain regimes in which one can do better. And again, you can look at the paper by Francis for some of these examples. And in fact, this norm here that we have, like this variation norm, if you instantiate these units, for example, using a value, in fact, one can control them by quantities that are a bit more accessible, right? That really that are expressed in terms of like basic properties of the original function, for example, the Fourier transform. And so here what we see is that if I have functions that are have this where this norm so this you can think about this norm here as some form of like a weighted L1 norm of the Fourier transform, right? So here what this result basically says is that if I have functions that are very sparse in the Fourier domain, then I can effectively approximate them with shallow neural networks. And this is actually classic work again from Baron in the 90s. And was developed further by several papers. But the question somehow is that this condition really looks very strong, right? It's like it seems like that this space should be quite small. And so this really raises up the question, okay, so you know, which functions we can actually study and construct that are not well approximated, that that are not going to have this kind of nice sparsity in the Fourier domain, but in fact we can approximate them well with other architectures, maybe deeper architectures. And so in particular, we know that this condition here is sufficient, right? But it seems very strong. So to what extent this condition is also necessary to get approximation in the shallow model? And also a question that is also driving this line of work is how can we rethink about this question of depth separation when we, instead of having functions that are defined over these d-dimensional Euclidean spaces, we have functions that are defined over more structured spaces, for example, images. So so the depth separation is an area that again has a lot of interesting prior work that starts from the community of Boolean circuits. So there's also nice foundational work that originates in that area and has been slowly percolating towards the analysis of neural networks. So in particular, there's just a few works that I want to mention here. There's one of the pioneering first works was by Matus Telgarsky that based these kind of approximate separation results on something that looks very combinatorial, right? So just counting the number of oscillations of a function and arguing that if I have a composition of functions, I can express more oscillations than if I don't have a composition, right? So that's the nature of these initial results. And these were essentially established for dimension 1. And then more related to what we are going to present next, there was this also very nice work by Ronen Eldan and Ohad Shamir that really constructed, that studied really the approximation rates in the high dimensional regime by looking at functions that have this funny radial structure. So think about the f of x, that is a properly chosen function g that is applied to the radius, like to the norm of x. And so through these kind of constructions, they could get separations. So namely, functions that are provably hard to approximate with a shallow network, but which admit a good approximation with a network that has one more layer. So one of the things that we embarked on is, okay, can we get a bit more general function separations, right? So, and can we try to understand a bit better the nature of these separations? So this is actually work together with my student Luca Venturi and also Sami Jelassi. And so here we consider functions that have a certain piecewise structure. And so we really express this piecewise structure in a way that is maybe not totally natural, but that's you know, I mean, that was our starting point, is to really look at functions that have this kind of piecewise oscillatory behavior, right? So this is a function f star that passes like some input to a ReLU unit, like the first layer, first hidden layer has like a ReLU structure, and then like every region of the underlying space is modulated, right, through a central frequency omega that we allow it to grow. And so the result that we establish is really really saying that when I have these kind of functions, I cannot approximate them with any shallow network unless the width is exponential. And in fact, I can approximate them very well with a function that with a network that has 2 hidden layers instead of 1. And really the technique behind this result is just at the end of the day, there's the idea that the technique is really just based on harmonic analysis in the dimensions, just looking at this approximation error in the Fourier domain, right? And this is really following the technique that was outlined in this original paper. And then one needs to be a bit careful because one needs to deal with this Fourier transform of a function that has this value in the middle. So that's just a little bit it's a little bit technical, but at the end of the day, it's nothing really new there. But one of the important things I want to mention is that for this result to hold, for this lower bound to hold, there's 2 necessary conditions, right, that are jointly necessary. The first one is that this needs to be measured with a data distribution mu that is heavy tail, right? So we need to actually look at approximation, like at metrics that look at the whole input space, right? And they cannot be too concentrated in space. And the other one is that we need to push these oscillations, right? So these oscillations need to increase with dimension, right? So we need to actually have functions that become really, really nasty or adversarial, right, for this lower bound to hold. And in the sense that if we don't have none of these 2 properties, right? So if we have functions that are not oscillating very much, and we try to measure the error in a compact domain, for example, at the unit ball, then we get basically an upper bound that is polynomial in dimension, right? So we can we can express that by saying that if I have a function f star that is any depth, any ReLU network of depth L with assumption on the norm of the weights. So the underlying assumption that this is capturing is the fact that we cannot really have oscillations that blow up with dimension. So you have this property, then we can actually approximate this function with a shallow neural network whose width is, again, has a very ugly dependency. Like this equation here is complicated, but the take home here is that the dependency is actually polynomial in dimension. It's very bad with respect to the error, right? So it's not polynomial in the error. But if you think that the error is, for this kind of like machine learning applications, you can think about the error as something that you don't necessarily need to make it go to 0, right? You can actually have an error that is, like a fixed error, and then see how it happens as the dimension increases. So that's this dependency that we have that is polynomial. And so the take home from these 2 results is that indeed one can find approximation gaps with depth. Of course, these are really just approximation. There's no optimization guarantee at this point at all. And somehow paint the picture that if we don't have structure in the input, so if you just treat the input as a high dimensional vector space, the results are a little bit somehow not very satisfactory, right? In the sense that we can construct these separations, but they bring us into spaces that are more and more exotic. And in fact, we cannot really say much beyond this barren condition, right? So this condition for some of these examples that I described is actually also necessary, right? So at the end, it's not something that we can learn too much from. And so, and the other thing to mention here is that for both of these results, it seems like, especially for the lower bounds seem hard to scale to extend to like a more general separation, right? So between like a K and K prime layers. And this is actually something that Ohad Shamia's group with Galvardi, they have a nice work that nice paper that like really pinpoints this hardness. Okay, so and this will be the last the last item that I will present today is try to do a little bit of a like a very humble a step into how can we bring a little bit of more structure into the problem, right? So instead of just looking at this problem in the Euclidean space, can we now try to incorporate some of the symmetries or some of the structure that we have in many problems in practice? So for this, we are going to first look at maybe the simplest instance of this structure, which is like the permutation symmetry, right? Like the symmetric group. So here, this corresponds to functions f that take as input a point cloud or like a set of observations. So it can be like a set of particles, a set of points, and the property that they have is that they are invariant with respect to any permutation of the points. So think about these coordinates here as being in some space, right? Doesn't need to be high dimensional here, right? So this space of parameters could be like R3 or like the R6 if you want to have momentum as well, etc. And so one of the things that we're interested on is to understand understand these functions not in terms of not when the number of particles is necessarily fixed, but like there's an underlying function doesn't really depend on how many particles I draw, right? So how many points I draw here. So in particular, we want to understand how to approximate and learn these functions in a way that is independent of the size, right? Of the size of the point cloud. So for this, we follow also actually some work that Gabriel I think developed with Marco also that tries to embed. The first thing that we do is that we embed the input to its corresponding empirical measure, right? So again, it's like the same flavor of before. And now we instead of trying to approximate this function that is defined over a discrete set, now we try to approximate and understand how to learn its corresponding extension, right? So this extension to the space of probability measures, right? And this extension is possible under certain under certain smoothness, right? So not all functions that are of this form can be extended, but under certain smoothness assumption, that's possible. So how can we actually now redo the presentation, right? Everything that we presented so far. How can we actually reformulate all these things in this framework? So now we can basically take the same perspective. And let me mention that this is actually work with Aaron Zweig, my student. So now we redefine a neuron to be again a rich function. So now it's instead of being a function that takes as input some finite dimensional vector, now it takes as input a probability, like an empirical probability measure over the domain. But formally we can write it exactly the same, right? So we can write a neuron to be a rich function, where now this dot product is basically the dot product associated with this linear form, right? So instead of having here phi to be a vector, right? Now it's a test function. Okay, so now this function is a test function. But once we have this formulation, now we can again set up the model that is a shallow neural network that now is going to be permutation invariant. And once we have this shallow neural network, of course we can look at the corresponding representation and basically follow the same research program that Francis outlined in his paper, right? So now try to understand different spaces that arise by several different degrees of adaptation. But the diagram here, you think that you have the input that is either the measure, if you think in terms of like more like the continuous extension, but like a point cloud. And the first level of feature learning, we are going to have to learn a domain, right, of test functions, because of course this space of test functions is infinite dimensional, right? So the first level of feature learning needs to identify a nice subspace of test functions. And once we have this subspace of test functions, we can do the second level of feature learning. We need to select the useful features from that space. And so just to express, so what is interesting is that now we can with these two layers of feature learning, for each of them we can choose either to be adaptive, so following this kind of variation norm model, or to be non-adaptive and take like a kernel. So it turns out that there's amongst the 4 possibilities, there's only 3 that make sense. And so define kind of a hierarchy of spaces that have the same like a nesting property as before. And so we can actually show with Aaron that these spaces are really one is included in the other, and they are actually quantitatively separated, right? So we can actually find functions that act as the, what used to be before, like the single neuron, right? So a single neuron is going to be well approximated if you have a lot of adaptivity, but poorly approximated if we have less adaptivity, and so on and so on. And so we get this generalization bounds and some interesting experiments that establish that verify that these spaces are actually more and more adaptive and learning more and more interesting structure. And so currently we are just working on looking at this framework and extending it to the fermion antisymmetry. So instead of now looking at the space of symmetric functions, now we study this in the context of antisymmetric functions. But this is going to be topic for another talk. So just as a wrap up, in terms of actually what are some of the open problems, or like directions that I think are interesting, at least for me, and I think that are touching over interesting questions, is really this idea that right now the ingredients for learning really combine two properties, right? Good approximation and good learning. And so in terms of understanding the benefit of depth, we are still in its infancy, right? Because we still don't understand very well how these two notions connect to each other. So one particular way to articulate that is that if I think about for a given function, I can try to understand how well this function, so this delta k, can be approximated if I use networks that have increasing depth, right? And this is like very informal here, right? So just think about like some kind of quantity that tells me like a kind of an approximation error that is obtained by like using a deeper and deeper model. And so there's one hypothesis is that if I look at these examples that have like strong depth separation, in the sense that this approximation error goes from being very, very, very bad to being very good, like in this here, this might actually create too much trouble. Like it might result in optimization problems that are too hard, right? That there's no way a gradient descent can learn this function. Whereas if I have a hypothesis that is something looking like in the bottom, like what we could call like a mild depth separation, then in fact this is like a sweet spot where we can actually benefit from the depth and at the same time provably find algorithms, right? And so this hypothesis has been studied through different angles by different works. So Alan Zhu and Yuan Li have some kind of like a sufficient, like some version of this hypothesis is sufficient for them, and then in some other works this hypothesis is also shown to be necessary for some like 1D distributions by some work by Malak and company. So there's actually interesting conjectures for, in particular, how to actually extend these hypotheses to, like to more realistic function spaces, and in particular, how to combine this hypothesis with the spatial structure of the data, right? The fact that that in many applications, the depth has to connect somehow with the scale, right, in which we are looking at the problem, and so that's something that planning keeping for future work. So with that, thank you very much, and of course, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Joan, for this amazing talk. At least on my side, I enjoyed it very much. A lot of very nice things. So as I say, you can post question in the chat if you want, or you can just speak basically. If everyone speaks at the same time, it could be complicated. But so maybe I can start by a question. So you define a lot of functional spaces, more and more complicated, I would say, and in particular at the end you spoke about this function defined on space of measure. In what sense do you think typical problems relevant for machine learning or with symmetries, the function will actually belong to these spaces? Maybe some simple problem that you could think of, and you could say, okay, this belongs to this space, and I can apply my theory.
Yeah. So for example, if you think about the problems in computational physics, like if you want to learn like the Hamiltonian of some system of particles, or like something that so that is a kind of a example I have in mind, where you could imagine to have a continuous extension, right? And some, like very loosely speaking, some of these reductions that use some kind of density functional, they have a little bit of this flavor, right? Where you can actually go from the particle to the measure to simplify the expression of the function. But you're right that in other applications this might sound a little bit artificial, right? For example, if you think about the max, that's a function that does not admit this continuous extension, right? So that would be a function that would not be the framework. But so just to mention, we have been playing recently with using this framework to learn robust statistics, like to, you know, if you have followed these problems that, like, for example, Gabor Lugosi has this nice work where they try to learn like robust mean estimator, right, from, you know, like very complicated heavy tail assumption in the data. So these kind of estimators, right, that are symmetric functions, we have been trying to toying a little bit on using these models to learn them. And it's interesting because, yeah, in the non-asymptotic version, right, where you have like a finite number of data points, they seem to outperform. I mean, they seem to actually do interesting things that are, you know, better than these kind of robust mean estimators.
And this would be example. So do you think they could be covered by the theory you developed? Like in terms of they have a small norm for one of the F1, F2, or F3, for instance.
That's a good question. So these of course these spaces are all dense, right? So you have a universal approximation, but it's true that like quantifying the for particular function of interest that you have like a nice adaptivity. I mean, beyond this adaptivity to low dimensional structures that is already present in the work of Francis. I don't have good examples of you know, other things like this, but actually that's definitely an interesting question. For, I mean, yeah, we haven't really pushed too much in that direction yet.
All right, thank you. Other question in the audience? See, everybody's shy. So okay, maybe so Pierre, do you want to speak? No, nobody's posting. So so it's you didn't cover this in your talk, but I'm wondering, what do you think about transformers architecture, Joan? Would they somehow fit into some of the work you present or you didn't present?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that it's also a symmetric function, and the architecture somehow is leveraging some hidden structure that is more like the so the architecture is presuming some metric that also needs to be learned from the data. And so, yeah, we haven't, I mean, I think that it would be interesting maybe to understand, like, yeah, from this kind of theoretical or functional perspective, what kind of prior are they leveraging that could be maybe, you know, like to try to understand the benefit of exploring this hidden metric structure, you know, in some like tractable theoretical framework. That I think would be interesting. But definitely, I think it's something that could be tractable. I don't know then if for this kind of transformer architectures, the embedding to the measure space seems a little bit too much, right? Because you don't want to go, you don't want to use like these infinite graphs to model these things. So that's something that maybe could be a roadblock. But I don't know, should think about it. It's interesting, definitely.
Maybe I can. So I have a large echo, but I will try to ask my question anyway. Thank you, Joan, for this great talk. I was wondering if you had some like necessary conditions on the function that you should use to preserve symmetry in the neural networks that you're using.
No, because the symmetry is preserved just by the embedding, right? So we have a so the way this model is implemented in practice is just, yeah, you introduce at the level of the algorithm, you implement at some point, you have to implement like a, you know, like a so I had a dot product between the measure and the test function, and when you implement this, when the measure is an empirical measure, it becomes an average, right? So the network by construction takes an average at some point. So other than that, there's no other technical no other thing that you need to enforce.
Hello, hi Joan, this is Thomas. I had some question related to this. So I don't know if you have heard of this deep sets network that try also to impose this kind of invariance, and they have some result on the different like necessary condition to get this invariance. And I wondered like how it was related to this idea of having like
So the deep set is
measure.
So the deep set is really looking at the problem for finite size. So they consider to be the number of points to be fixed. their analysis, and they have a kind of a hidden dimension parameter, this like kind of a dimension of the features, that for them they need to make it at least equal to the number of points to get this universal approximation. So at the end of the day, one can formally write down their model in our framework by just rewriting the second layer activation function. And also, it's I mean the other difference is that they have a sum instead of an average. I mean, for them it doesn't matter because the n is fixed, but in fact, yeah, you can formally embed their model into ours. And so the difference with ours is that we basically get rid of the n, right, of the number of particles at the input.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I saw that it was somewhat a bit limited to the sum, and there is this question of how do you move n. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, if you look at our paper, there's some details on how these two frameworks connect.
Oh, great, thanks.
So I think Umut has a question. If he can speak, it's kind of a technical question, so it's better if he speaks.
Well, okay,
yeah.
so let me try to say it. So what I was saying was, like, in some recent studies, which I also co-authored, we showed that like some heavy-tailed behavior in the network weights can emerge, and then this can be due to some heavy-tailedness in the data, or it can be due to the multiplicative noise in SGD, because the noise is getting multiplied by the weights all the times. And then this can create some heavy tails where the variance is even infinite. So I was wondering, like, what sort of analysis should this require in terms of the mean field limit, because the Wasserstein 2 won't be available for us anymore. And the second question is, like, you mentioned some heavy tailedness in the data distribution. In some points you said like there's a difference between if the data is heavy tailed or not. And do you think the heavy tailedness of the network weights could have a relationship with this, or would there be some interaction if they are both heavy tailed? Would there be some interesting feature or something?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Yeah, so for the first part, I mean, it's true that so if I understand what you said, this heavy tail that you observe is also a product, is a result of the algorithm that you use, like a stochastic gradient descent. And can you recover this heavy tail by just using a kind of a batch model with gradient descent or gradient flow?
I mean, if there's batch gradient descent, then there is no stochasticity, then there is no heavy tails. But if you have a stochastic gradient where some randomness, and depending on some technical things, then you might have some heavy tails.
Yeah. So this, yeah, so this is, it's interesting because so what I presented and this framework is right now just limited, restricted to cover this deterministic dynamics, just the gradient descent or gradient flow. I think it would be very interesting. So I know that there's some of the other dynamics that are like at diffusion, like just kind of a Langevin sort of noise, and they can still be analyzed using this kind of measure formulation. But then I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I don't know enough about stochastic differential equations, even like how they result in the space of measures, to see if your stochastic dynamics could also be understood in that framework. But I think that's definitely interesting to think about. And then for the second one, so
but before the second one, I remember you had Laplacian in one of your PDs,
yes,
right? So you have some stochasticity in some sense.
Yeah,
so that's why
that was the so that one is the easy one, right? Where you have these like Langevin, right? It's just a Gaussian noise, but if the heavy tail would give you a different kind of behavior at the level of the measure. Interesting. And then for the data, for the heavy tail in the data distribution, so at this as just to precise, right? This result is purely about approximation, right? There's no interaction with how the weights are learned, etc. It's really about like just the pure approximation result. So there, it's what we see is that for that kind of detailed data distribution, if you think about the lower bound means that any weights that you put, like in the shallow network, even if they are arbitrarily large, are not going to give you good approximation, right? So it's not it doesn't express something that is limited by the norm of the weights. In the upper bound for the 3-layer neural network, I believe that we can also use things that do not blow up, right? Like basically we rely on the fact that these distributions are heavy-tailed, but we can still have some control on the tails, right? To get this upper bound. And so we don't need the weights to really blow up. But you're right. I mean, that trying to understand this thing, you know, in more fine-grained. I mean, at this point, this result is not, you know, it works for very specific class of heavy tail distributions, right? It's not something quite universal yet.
Okay, I understand. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for this very sharp question and sharp answers. So I think if there's no more question, we should thank Joan for his great talk. At least I will applaud. Thank you, Joan.
Okay, thank you, Gabriel.
Yeah, it feels always a bit weird. And so see you next month for the next PRAIRIE seminar that will be announced very soon, still at 2 o'clock